Alright, this video will be about England during the Absolutist era, which is typically the 1600s. So, the first point to start on is Queen Elizabeth was the queen in the later part of the 1500s. She dies in 1603. She did not have any heirs, so that ends the Tudor family dynasty upon her death. And so they bring in the closest lineage, which happened to be Mary, Queen of the Scots, but the male king, King James, is going to be the one that becomes the king in England. Now in Scotland, he is the king. He is King James VI in Scotland, but for England it's King James I. Now, something to be aware of is England is a Protestant state religion. So they believe in essentially not to follow the Pope. They have some of the similar points of the Roman Catholic Church, but generally it differs a little bit from sacraments, and certainly the Pope is a big one there too. King James, however, is a Roman Catholic, and the English don't want to go back to a Roman Catholic type of religion, and certainly don't want it enforced. That would mean much of the population would be persecuted if England changed the state religion to Roman Catholic. So that was a concern for many of the English. But when King James comes in, he believes in divine right, meaning that the rulers are appointed or chosen by God, and he believes that he is only responsible to God as well. So he is willing to break laws that certainly the English don't care for, since they have a tradition in which the kings are supposed to follow the laws of England. So already, as soon as he comes in, he's going to start alienating the wealthy, as well as many of the peasants as well. So the church is unsure about King James, and the Parliament is unsure of King James. So a lot of issues when he comes in. So they basically deal with him for a time. So from 1603 to 1624 is going to be the time of King James. Then his heir, Charles I, comes to the throne. He is going to reign from 1625 to 1644. Now, he really is going to start the track of absolutism and a lot of the other issues going on in England. This is going to be a stark difference from France, for example. So, one of the first things he does is in 1628, he comes up with something called the Petition of Right. Basically, what this does was it prohibits taxation, it outlaws arbitrary imprisonment, quartering of soldiers in private homes, and martial law without the consent of Parliament. This is forwarded by the Parliament, and Charles I is more or less forced to go along with it. So how he gets around this, since Charles I is trying to expand world power, and certainly James I was making some effort to expand world power, very much like what King Louis XIV was doing in France. So what he decides to do is from 1629 to 1640, he's not going to call Parliament into session whatsoever. This is going to be how he avoids any sort of restrictions on his power through this petition of right. So he's going to be able to do whatever he wants if he if Parliament isn't in session, they can't really discuss what's going on, because the king is the only one that can call Parliament. So for this period of time from 1629 to 1640, Parliament is not going to be called. Charles then marries Henrietta, which is going to be the sister of King Louis XIII of France, and it starts to look like he might be starting to shift the state religion to Catholic, which of course is not pleasant for a lot of the English. He's also going to force the Anglican Church on Scotland, and as a result, the Scots are going to revolt. And the Scots are Roman Catholic. They don't feel like they want a religion forced upon them. So the typical practice, as I mentioned in earlier videos, was to crush the rebellion with an army, but an army costs money. So he's actually forced to call Parliament for taxes to pay for the troops to put down this revolt. So Parliament decides that they need to work out some sort of compromise. We'll give you this money to raise an army to put down the Scottish rebellion, but you're going to have to take back everything you've pretty much done while they were not in session. So basically, Parliament is going to prohibit any court or taxes and pretty much everything that Charles put into place when they were not in session. But also they force him to sign the Triennial Act, which is a requirement that Parliament has to meet every 3 years. So they can only go 3 years without being in session. Then they could call it into session, they meet, and they can discuss whatever they see fit. Now, Parliament is actually going to be split over the elimination of some of the bishops and other clergy members that Charles has actually put into place in Scotland as well as in England. Now, some members believe that these bishops and clergy can stay put, others want them out. So this becomes a little bit of a debate within Parliament. So Charles takes matters into his own hands by arresting what he perceives as the radical members of Parliament, those who want to kick out his appointments. What that does is it sparks the English Civil War that's going to last from 1642 to 1646. The reason why this sparks a rebellion and eventually a civil war is because the king has agreed he's going to allow Parliament to assemble, to debate, and work with him for the state of England. But if he's going to arrest members he doesn't care for, that's a violation of that. And so they view this as an attack on Parliament and England itself. This brings in one of the more famous individuals, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is a Puritan, and many of the more powerful leaders during the Civil War are going to be Puritans. Oliver Cromwell is actually going to become the general of the parliamentary forces, and they formed their England's first standing professional army during the Civil War. And with this full-time military, which we've discussed in previous videos, they are able to defeat the royal forces. So Charles is going to be captured in 1646. So what Parliament does after this war is they have to figure out what to do with Charles. Some members want Charles to be reinstated as king, some want him to not be king, and there not to be a king at all in England. So they're trying to figure out what to do with Charles and what kind of government they really want to form. While this is going on, Charles actually escapes. And so this restarts the Civil War, because there's still people who are loyal to the king in England. And so in 1648 you have a renewed effort of the Civil War. But Oliver Cromwell is able to defeat these forces once again. Charles is captured again. And what Cromwell decides to do is there's a debate going on still about what to do with Charles, and his enemies are generally from the Presbyterian members of Parliament. This is a faction of the Calvinist religious Protestant movement. So he basically eliminates them from Parliament. He doesn't kill them, he just removes them. And then Charles is going to be charged with treason. Many of these Presbyterians also were against charging Charles with treason and then killing him. So with the removal of the Presbyterians in Parliament, he's able to, one, try Charles with treason against the state, and then to behead him. And he is going to be beheaded on January 30th, 1649. So now you don't have a king. Parliament is still intact, but is split, and it's kind of in shambles. So Cromwell is the one who is in power, and so he decides he's going to abolish the monarchy, and he's going to keep with Parliament, but he is going to eliminate the House of Lords section of the Parliament. So now you're not going to have any nobles in play with the National Assembly. You're only going to have middle class, merchants, professionals, barons and non-lords and nobles of that faction. There was actually a group rising in Parliament at this time that advocated for free speech, religious toleration, a democratic republic, women's rights, and so on and so forth, sounding very similar to what the United States government, and certainly the English government, looks like today. But that was seen as radical by Oliver Cromwell, and so they were crushed and dispersed from Parliament. At this time, also, Ireland and Scotland is going to rebel against Oliver Cromwell. He sends an army and crushes their rebellions as well. So he has control over England, Scotland, and Ireland through military force. And so he looks very much like an absolutist type of ruler, since he does have a lot of power. He himself is going to basically elect himself to be the executive branch, so very much like President of the United States. And then the Parliament would be the legislative branch, very much like Congress. So there are some similarities as far as government going on here. But in 1655, Oliver Cromwell is going to dissolve Parliament altogether because he sees them as potentially usurping his power, so he just eliminates it completely. He's going to divide England into 11 different regions. They're going to be ruled by the military, have military governors, and he's going to start taxing anyone who is loyal to the king. So the government of England does not look very good at this point. It was a constitutional monarchy, where the monarchy did have a lot of power. Now you've transitioned to where you don't have a monarchy at all, but actually it's has an assembly. But now you've, by 1655, has eliminated that assembly. So now you have basically absolutist ruler. He has complete control and power. But it's not going to last very long. By 1658, Cromwell is going to die. And so as a result, he's only going to rule for a couple years in this final form of government. So now England is thrust with trying to figure out what to do with England after Cromwell dies. And so they've determined that the times of old were stable, and so they want to return to a constitutional monarchy where you're going to have a parliament with a House of Lords, a House of Commons, but now you need a king. And so they ask Charles II, who is actually the son of Charles I, who left England, very smart of him, by the way, He's living in France, and so they ask him, hey, you want to be king? He says, sure, why not? Sounds like a great idea. Government is going to be restored to the way things were before the Civil War. The Anglican Church is going to be established as the state religion. There are going to be laws that persecute other religions, for example, Catholics and Puritans. So this is going to cause some Puritans to go over to North America, hence the situation with Plymouth Rock. But by 1672, they are going to allow some religious freedom towards Catholics and Puritans, which is all well and good for them. But by 1673, it goes into the other direction where they're not going to be persecuted, they're going to be tolerated, but if you want to be in the military or in any sort of governmental position, you're going to have to be an Anglican, and there's actually going to be a test to ensure that you're actually an Anglican. Yeah, things aren't really going very well as far as religion is concerned. Now, Parliament is going to be split around this period of time because they're looking into the future, and Charles II has a son. He is going to be King James II, but he seems to potentially maybe thinking about changing the religion and the state religion. So Parliament is split into two different sides. To just go along with James II, support James II and whatever he decides. This party or group is going to be called the Tories. The other group, the Whigs, are going to be against having King James come to the throne. They want a Protestant king, and to be ensured some sort of stability like what was had during Queen Elizabeth's time. So this is originally how you get the Whigs and Tories, which is still relevant in English politics today. This is originally where they got their names. Now, looking at this situation where you have basically after Queen Elizabeth, you have uncertainty about the Protestant religion, but also a lot of political discord after Queen Elizabeth. So in part due to the rebellions and the chaos going on after Queen Elizabeth, many of the English are going to view Queen Elizabeth I as the golden age and a great ruler. That's certainly going to influence their decision and how we basically tell history on at least that aspect. Now in 1681, Charles is going to dismiss Parliament. He knows that there are dissenting voices, so he's just going to dismiss Parliament so he doesn't have to deal with them. 4 years later, Charles is going to unfortunately die. Which brings in, of course, King James II. Now, he is a Catholic ruler, which, of course, as just mentioned, that made quite a few people nervous. He appointed quite a few Catholics to high positions of power. It looked like basically there was going to potentially be some persecution of Protestants. And Parliament decided that they were going to just tolerate these actions, at least for a time. They figured he was old, he wasn't going to last very long anyway, so let's just bear this burden, and then after he dies, we can move on to a Protestant ruler and not upset basically the balance in English politics. But then on June 10th, 1688, he is going to have a son born. So now there's a potential of a Catholic heir. And so that changes things significantly for the English Parliament. They certainly don't want to deal with a young Catholic ruler in England. And so what they do is they look at the lineages, what connections there are to the English throne. And they find out that there's a distant connection with Mary, who is actually married to William of Orange in the Netherlands. Mary is the daughter of James II. She is a Protestant. So this basically qualifies a connection that they would care for. So the English nobles, encouraged by the Parliament, are going to extend the English crown to Mary and William and invite them to come over to basically assume the throne. Now, William is completely fine with this because he's the king of the Netherlands, and he is currently at war with France at this period of time. So if you could add England to the war effort, he's completely okay with that. More troops, more weapons, more resources. So this is a win-win for him. So he accepts without too much thought. So in 1688 is when he comes over to assume the throne and become the new King of England, King William. This event is called the Glorious Revolution because, one, the main reason is essentially there is no violence at all. So it's a bloodless coup. He becomes the new King of England. In 1689, Parliament declares that James II has violated the agreement between Parliament and the monarchy and the citizens, and so they declare that he is basically in violation and treasonous. So that's their reasoning for kicking him out, and so William then takes the throne. In 1689, also, there's a Bill of Rights. Basically, Parliament is the only one that has the authority to make laws, levy taxes, form a standing army, and have free and open debates. So these rights cannot be restricted. The citizens also have the right to basically petition a sovereign government, keep arms, have a trial by jury, and not have any sort of excessive bail when they are arrested. And then finally in 1689, they're also going to have a Toleration Act lashed onto that Bill of Rights, which is tolerations for Puritans. Catholics initially are going to be excluded, but they're going to be added in there a little bit later. And this essentially ends religious persecution in England. While Catholics weren't included in the initial Toleration Act of 1689, they really didn't bother the Catholics. They were tired of these religious wars, and that's kind of what makes England a little bit unique during this period of time. They had freedom of religion before 1700. So England was really the place to be, to escape to, if you wanted that sort of freedom. And so with William, you now have the foundation of a constitutional monarchy, a stable government, an efficient government with a parliament and a monarchy working together to build up and strengthen England. And this is really going to lead into England dominating the 1700s and becoming the start for the British Empire. So quite a different story than France. They are a rather healthy state. They are not bankrupt. They do not have a lot of enemies. They form a government that is the inspiration for a lot of governments around the world. And certainly a lot of aspects are going to be borrowed from the United States when they create their own country later on. So the question of absolutism, is absolutism, does it come about? Yes, but very briefly. It doesn't really last that long whatsoever. You have it under Oliver Cromwell, but then it quickly dies after his death, and you have a return, or an attempted return, to the governmental style in England, with a parliament and a monarchy working together to build a greater state and a stable state that is actually quite unique in Europe at this period of time. If you look at the other states in Europe, there's a lot of warfare, a lot of chaos. Certainly England did partake in some warfare, but it's a stable environment that is going to be conducive for a peaceful transition from monarchy to monarchy, and you're going to have the situation that provokes good economic ties. Wealth is going to be very easy to come by. And later on, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, this is part of the reason why the Industrial Revolution is going to occur as well. So if you want some reasons or some significances of this era of absolutism, it provides a stable government to provide for scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and eventually the British Empire, that provides a lot of the aspects for the creation of the United States and a lot of modern concepts that come about in Europe. And of course we'll delve into those in later sections. So that's about it for absolutism for England.